Hi guys. Um, this is actually a lecture that I wanted to record beforehand, so it's not one of the ones I need you to respond to. However, it would be helpful if you let me know if you have any questions, or if you have any arguments or thesis statements you want me to troubleshoot. I'll talk about that at the end, but I'm going to record a response lecture to this so that you can get answers to those questions, and so you can see some troubleshooting of thesis statements in real time. So really do send me them if you're interested. I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But I wanted this to just be a pretty focused lecture on how to make arguments and then how to troubleshoot them once you've got them. And I find that the troubleshooting is actually the main part of constructing a good argument. And so this is a system that I use in teaching, but I also use it for myself. So I think this really applies throughout your college career and afterwards. I think some of these things are just hallmarks of good arguments. So let's get started. The elements of an argument are pretty straightforward. Some of them will be familiar to you. One of them is that it be arguable. This sounds basic and straightforward, but what I mean by this is it can't just be an observation. And it has to be something that a reasonable person seeing the same things that you are seeing could disagree with. The other thing that it has to be is narrow. And this is especially important in an 8-page paper, which is not as long as you think it is. It also has to be motivated. And by this, I mean that there has to be some sort of so what behind it. There has to be a sense of why you're making this argument and, why it might be an important argument to make. The last thing is that it needs to be in conversation with other scholars or with stuff that has already been written about this. And I'm putting this in lieu of originality because realistically, in your undergraduate and even in your graduate work, you will not be making a lot of original arguments, but you will be making arguments that are in conversation with things that other people have said about it, about your topic. And that's the most important, to sort of enter into conversation with something that's already going on and not just sort of be pulling conclusions out of the source material as though no one has ever talked about it before. So that's the main standard for what is usually called originality in my understanding. So to get into a bit of an example, I wanted to talk about Terry v. Ohio because it's something that you all read carefully and wrote case briefs on. So if we're trying to come up, you want to write about Terry v. Ohio, and you're trying to come up with a thesis statement. One thing that you could say is that before Terry v. Ohio, stop and frisk was already police practice. This is fine, this is true. However, it obviously is just still an observation. So this doesn't get us very far. This is not something that you can argue with. So it kind of violates the arguability clause. So how do we make this something that is arguable? Well, you can base your argument off of this observation. It's a good observation, and it seems like you might be able to get relevant things out of it. So next, I would say, okay, so let's say something about this that might be arguable. One claim you could make is that the majority decision in Terry v. Ohio was influenced by police practice. Okay, so this is a little bit better because we're making an argument about cause. So the majority decision in Terry v. Ohio was influenced by police practice. This is just a statement about fact. This is getting a little bit more into the arguable issue. So it checks off arguable. It's kind of missing the narrow issue though, because police practice, that's a pretty big issue. Majority decision, there are a lot of things they talk about in the majority decision. So these things are not narrow. and they're going to be difficult to write about in 8 pages. So let's narrow that down a bit. What about the majority decision? Well, one of the things that comes to mind that we talked about a bunch is reasonable suspicion as a standard. You could say reasonable suspicion, so we've now narrowed down the majority decision aspect a little bit, was created to accommodate the already widespread practice of stop and frisk without probable cause. Okay, so now we've got something that is a lot more narrow because we're talking about reasonable suspicion rather than, the entire majority decision. And we're talking about stop and frisk without probable cause, which is a subset of police practice. So we've narrowed it down considerably, and it's still arguable. So we're still ticking that box. What I would do next is consider the motivation. So this is an interesting observation and an interesting claim to make, right? Reasonable suspicion came out of an already widespread practice of stop and frisk. I would ask myself, so what? So if I'm right, what's the consequence of that? So let's think about what the consequence of that would be. One thing that we talked about is that reasonable suspicion is kind of difficult to define because it seems to be higher than normal suspicion, but lower than probable cause. So you could say reasonable suspicion is difficult to define. That's the mystery that we're solving because it was created to accommodate the already widespread practice of stop and frisk without probable cause. Okay, so now we've sort of created a little bit of a mystery that we're going to solve. And this gets to the motivation. This is the mystery that's going to be solved by this thesis statement. Reasonable suspicion is difficult to define because it was created to accommodate the already widespread practice of stop and frisk without probable cause. So this, I think, is a reasonable thesis statement, and it's something that you could talk about at length. It's something that you could definitely write an 8-page paper about. The last thing that I would put in here is the issue of in conversation. So I'll record another lecture about literature reviews, which is most of where you're going to talk about the in conversation. That's where you talk about what other people have said and where you are within that discourse. But it can be helpful even at this stage to indicate that there are other people who have written about this. So you could say many have written about the confusion created by the standard reasonable suspicion. You could even say exactly what the confusion is, noting that its only parameters seem to be that it rises above normal suspicion and below probable cause. I argue that this confusion stems from the fact that the majority in Terry v. Ohio attempted to accommodate the already widespread practice of stop and frisk with the created or imaginary standard suspicion that could be a whole thesis statement. It's a little bit long for a thesis statement, and if you were going to cut it down, I would just actually go with this previous one. But this part is important because it sets up where you're coming to this conversation from. So you're coming to it from the fact that many people have already written about the confusion in this standard, and then you are giving an answer. I argue that this confusion stems from the fact. So another thing to talk about is, I know this always comes up, is the I. I think most college professors would say this is absolutely standard practice to say I. Anything else is a little bit confusing. It's always best to be clear. So just say, I argue. If you really feel uncomfortable with it, you can say this paper argues, but absolutely use the first person. I know that's not exactly what they tell you in high school, but it's absolutely best practice in every discipline I've ever encountered. So let's move on to troubleshooting. This is a little bit of a hokey thing, but it's a really great way to troubleshoot your thesis statement once you already have it. I want to emphasize that this is not the format in which you should write your thesis statement. So please, to reiterate, do not write your thesis statement this way. This is simply, once you have a thesis statement, a way to check to make sure that you're on track. So the magic thesis statement is, by looking at blank, we can see blank, which most people don't see. This is important because, so here, this is going to be your subject of study. And this subject should be narrow, and it should also give you a sense of method. How are you going to look at it? How are you going to consider this subject? This is your conclusion. And this is generally what we think of as our main argument. So this is what you're claiming once you've looked at your subject of study. And it should also be in conversation or original. There has to be something different about how you're going about it. And that sort of comes in here. This is important because this is your motivation. So this is the so what. And specifically, what does this help us understand? And so if we take the Terry example and fill it in here, we would say, by looking at the standard, reasonable suspicion. Sorry, my handwriting is even worse on an iPad. We can see that it was created to respond to existing police practice, which most people don't see. This is important because it helps us understand why the standard is difficult to define. So this is okay. We've got a pretty narrow subject here. That's fine. And the conclusion is also fine. I would say that the subject isn't actually what you're talking about. The subject is actually the confusion that arises out of the standard reasonable suspicion. So I might actually start over with this part and say, by looking at the difficulty the law has had in defining reasonable suspicion. Okay. Then we can see that the standard was an attempt to accommodate police practice and therefore does not refer directly to constitutional standards. So this has helped me clarify a little bit what exactly I'm talking about. I'm actually not talking about reasonable suspicion. I'm talking about the difficulty the law has had in defining it. So the helpful thing about breaking it up this way is that you're forced to really hone in on what your subject is. It can't be this sort of nebulous or broad issue. It has to be something very specific that you're going to look at in a specific way so as to come to this conclusion. And so these have to be really intimately connected. And one has to lead directly to the other. So that's how I would go about troubleshooting this. This is already a pretty refined thesis statement, actually, because we went through all of that stuff above. But sometimes it can be difficult to start actually with the standard up here because this can seem a little bit nebulous. Down here, if you're forced to really put it into a sentence, then it has to be short. If you run out of breath before you reach the end of the sentence, then it is too long. And it also forces you to break down the parts of your argument. So it can be really useful in that way. If you send me your thesis statement, either in the comments below or through email, I would love to troubleshoot it for you in a response lecture. And I think that might be really helpful to students so that they can see a thesis statement being troubleshooted in real time. And I don't have to put your name to it or anything like that. So just let me know if you have one that you want me to troubleshoot. I can also do this privately over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever we work out. So thank you guys. Drop any questions you have in the comments or in email to me, and I will also try to address those in a response lecture. Thank you guys.